study of power, ego, insecurity, and control. When you finished the book, what was your immediate reaction?
I felt like I'd been inside someone's mind rather than someone's career, and not a calm mind. Ellison comes across as brilliant, wounded, competitive to the point of obsession. The company feels like an extension of his psychology.
That's a great way to put it. Oracle doesn't just reflect Ellison's vision, it reflects his temperament, his hunger, his paranoia, his refusal to lose. Did you feel like the book argues that Oracle couldn't exist without those traits?
Yes, and that's one of its central tensions. The very qualities that make Ellison difficult also make Oracle formidable. The book quietly asks whether greatness at that scale requires a certain level of damage.
That question haunted me too, because Ellison is not portrayed as someone seeking harmony or balance. He's seeking dominance. From the earliest pages, competition isn't just a strategy, it's an identity.
Competition is how he knows who he is. Without an opponent, he seems almost unanchored.
Which brings us to his childhood, the adoption, the emotional distance, the sense of being unwanted. The book doesn't psychoanalyze lazily, but it's hard not to draw lines between that early instability and his later obsession with control.
Absolutely. Being adopted and raised in an emotionally reserved household seems to create this deep need to prove worth, not through belonging, but through superiority. Love becomes something you earn by winning.
That's such a sharp observation. It feels like Ellison doesn't want acceptance, he wants validation through conquest.
Yes, acceptance is too passive. Validation must be extracted.
And Oracle becomes the battlefield. The way he talks about competitors is striking. They're not rivals, they're enemies. Did that intensity surprise you?
Not after a while. Early on, it's jarring. Later, it becomes predictable. Ellison frames the world in zero-sum terms. If someone else is winning, he's losing. There's no neutral ground,
Which makes collaboration difficult.
or impossible unless he's in control.
The book also spends a lot of time on Ellison's relationship to intelligence. He clearly sees himself as smarter than almost everyone around him. Did you read that as confidence or insecurity?
Both, but leaning toward insecurity. When intelligence needs constant demonstration, it's usually defending something fragile. He doesn't just want to be smart, he wants it acknowledged continuously.
That need for acknowledgement shows up in how he treats people. Engineers, executives, even friends. Praise feels conditional. Loyalty is rewarded, but dissent is punished.
Yes, the culture of Oracle mirrors that. Fear is an organizing principle, not always explicit, but always present.
Which raises an ethical question. If a company succeeds because of fear-driven excellence, does the outcome justify the environment?
That's one of the hardest questions the book raises without answering. Oracle delivers results, but at what human cost? And who gets to decide that cost is acceptable?
Ellison would probably say the market decides.
Of course he would. That shifts responsibility away from individual choices and onto abstraction.
Let's talk about his relationship to money. He accumulates extraordinary wealth, but money never feels like the end goal.
No, money is a scoreboard. It's evidence. Power is the real currency.
Power over markets, over narratives, over people.
Exactly. Wealth enables power, but power is the addiction.
Another imaginary scenario. If Ellison had achieved moderate success, enough to be comfortable but not dominant, do you think he would have been satisfied?
Not even slightly. Satisfaction would feel like stagnation. He needs escalation.
So ambition isn't about achieving something specific.
It's about never stopping.
That reminds me of how he treats victory. Even when Oracle wins, the tone is rarely celebratory. It's strategic, cold.
Because celebration implies rest, and rest invites vulnerability.
Which seems intolerable to him.
Yes, vulnerability is weakness. Weakness is annihilation.
The book also explores Ellison's relationship to truth. He's comfortable with bending narratives, reframing losses, exaggerating wins. Did you see that as dishonesty or strategy?
In his mind, it's strategy. Truth is subordinate to advantage. If perception shapes reality, then controlling perception becomes ethical in his framework.
That's chilling.
It is, but it's also consistent. He's not hypocritical about it. He doesn't pretend to value transparency for its own sake.
That consistency almost makes it harder to criticize.
Yes, because he's honest about his ruthlessness.
Let's pause on that. Is honesty about ruthlessness a virtue?
Not morally, but psychologically, it removes self-deception. The harm still exists, but it's not hidden behind false ideals.
Which brings us to leadership. Many people study Ellison as a model of decisive leadership. Do you think his style is replicable?
Not sustainably. It depends too much on a singular personality. Remove Ellison, and the system struggles.
So Oracle is both empowered and endangered by him.
Exactly. He's the engine and the instability.
Before we go further, I want to ask this. Did you feel any sympathy for Ellison while reading?
Yes, and that surprised me. Not sympathy for his choices, but for the inner emptiness that seems to drive them. The book suggests a man who never feels finished.
Never finished, never safe.
Never enough.
That's a heavy place to live.
It is, and it explains a lot.
That sense of never being enough feels like the emotional engine of the entire book. And it raises a question I kept coming back to while reading. Is Larry Ellison driven by desire or by fear?
I think fear comes first. Desire follows. The fear of being insignificant, replaceable, forgotten. Desire becomes the strategy he uses to outrun that fear.
That framing changes how we see his ambition. It's not about building something meaningful in the abstract. It's about never letting the ground settle under his feet.
Yes. Stability feels dangerous to him. If things stabilize, there's time to reflect. And reflection might expose the emptiness he's trying to avoid.
Which might explain why Oracle is always at war. Even when there's no immediate threat, Ellison seems to manufacture one.
Exactly. Conflict keeps the system alive, internally and externally. A company at peace might turn inward, and inward is where doubt lives.
That inward avoidance shows up in his personal relationships too. The book doesn't dwell sentimentally on his marriages or friendships, but there's a pattern of distance. Did you notice how transactional many of those relationships felt?
Very much. Relationships seem valuable insofar as they align with his momentum. Emotional reciprocity feels secondary. Control and admiration matter more than intimacy.
Which is striking given how charismatic he can be.
Charisma is often a substitute for intimacy. It creates connection without vulnerability.
That's such an important distinction. People are drawn to him, but he doesn't have to open himself fully in return.
Exactly. He performs closeness while maintaining autonomy.
The book also emphasizes how Ellison surrounds himself with brilliance but keeps ultimate authority centralized. He hires smart people but rarely empowers them fully. How did you interpret that?
As insecurity disguised as leadership, he values intelligence, but only if it reinforces his position. Independent centers of power are threats, not assets.
So innovation is encouraged, but only within strict boundaries.
Yes, creativity without obedience is dangerous in his system.
That creates a paradox. Oracle thrives on cutting-edge thinking, yet suppresses dissent.
And that paradox only works because Ellison himself remains the final arbiter. His intuition substitutes for process.
Which makes the company incredibly agile, but also fragile.
Precisely. It's strong as long as he's strong.
Here's a moment in the book where Simons describes Ellison's delight in humiliating competitors publicly. Not just defeating them, but embarrassing them. How did you react to that?
That was one of the most disturbing parts for me. Victory isn't enough. There's a need to dominate psychologically. It suggests unresolved anger.
Anger directed outward, but rooted inward.
Yes, Humiliation becomes a way to externalize shame.
That makes the competitive landscape feel less like business and more like personal theater.
It is theater. Oracle's battles are symbolic reenactments of earlier emotional struggles.
Another imaginary scenario. If Ellison had grown up in a household that was emotionally warm, affirming, secure, do you think Oracle would exist in the same form?
I doubt it. The drive would be different. Maybe innovation would still happen, but the cruelty, the obsession with dominance, that might be softened. The company's culture would likely be less adversarial.
So the company is, in a sense, a crystallization of unresolved childhood dynamics.
Yes. That's one of the book's most unsettling implications.
Let's talk about ethics. Ellison often frames decisions purely in terms of winning. Market share, legal advantage, strategic leverage. Do you think the book suggests he has an ethical framework at all?
He has one, but it's instrumental rather than moral. Ethics are subordinate to success. If an action advances Oracle's dominance, it's justified.
That's a dangerous worldview when scaled.
It is, especially in technology, where decisions shape entire ecosystems.
The book was written in an era before today's conversations about tech responsibility. But reading it now, it feels almost prophetic.
Yes, Ellison represents an early archetype of tech power without social accountability. He doesn't pretend to be benevolent.
Which again makes him strangely honest.
Honest, but not harmless.
How did you feel about the way Simmons writes him? Do you think the author maintains enough critical distance?
I think Simmons walks a careful line. He doesn't demonize Ellison, but he doesn't romanticize him either. The intimacy is observational, not celebratory.
I noticed that too. The book feels like it's saying, this is who he is, now decide how you feel about it,
Exactly. It refuses to moralize overtly.
which puts more responsibility on the reader.
Yes, you can't outsource judgment.
Let's talk about risk. Ellison is often described as a risk taker, but the book complicates that. His risks are calculated asymmetric. Did you see that?
Absolutely. He takes risks when the downside can be absorbed. True vulnerability is rare. He wants boldness without exposure.
So courage is strategic, not existential.
Well put. He's fearless in battle, but guarded in self-disclosure.
That guardedness shows up again in how he handles failure. Failures are reframed, minimized, or externalized.
Yes, failure is unacceptable as an identity marker. It must be neutralized quickly.
Which reinforces the idea that worth is conditional.
Always conditional on winning.
Do you think Ellison is happy?
I don't think happiness is a useful concept for him. Satisfaction is fleeting. Contentment feels alien. He's animated, not fulfilled.
Animated is such a precise word.
Because motion matters more than arrival.
As we move toward the end of this conversation, I want to ask you something fundamental. Is Larry Ellison admirable?
In certain dimensions, yes. His intelligence, his strategic clarity, his refusal to self-delude. But admiration doesn't require emulation,
That distinction feels crucial.
because copying the behavior without understanding the cost would be disastrous.
And the cost is real.
Very real for him and for those around him.
So the book becomes less a guide and more a warning.
Or a mirror, depending on what you bring to it.
That's a good place to pause, because the final stretch of the book and of this conversation asks us to consider legacy, not just success,
Yes. What remains when the battles end?
and whether winning was ever the point.
Or just the method?
What remains when the battle's end might be the most unsettling question the book leaves us with, because it's the one Ellison seems least interested in answering. Legacy, for him, feels less like reflection and more like positioning.
Yes. Legacy isn't about being understood. It's about being undeniable. He wants to be part of the infrastructure, not the conversation.
That's a powerful distinction. Infrastructure is invisible until it fails. It just exists, shaping behavior silently.
And that's exactly where Ellison seems most comfortable. Power that doesn't need applause. Only compliance.
which contrasts sharply with more contemporary tech leaders who publicly perform concern, ethics, even vulnerability.
Ellison predates that performance. He doesn't apologize for wanting to win. He doesn't soften the edges. In a strange way, that makes him feel more honest, even if the values are harsh.
But honesty doesn't equal harmlessness.
No. And the book never suggests it does. It simply presents a man whose clarity of purpose overrides almost everything else.
There's a moment near the end where you sense Ellison is aware of aging, of time narrowing. But even then, the response isn't introspection, it's consolidation,
Yes, aging doesn't lead him inward, it leads him upward. More control, more certainty, fewer variables.
which makes me wonder if self-reflection is something he views as indulgent.
I think he sees it as inefficient. Reflection that doesn't lead to advantage is wasted energy.
That worldview feels incompatible with vulnerability.
Completely. Vulnerability introduces unpredictability. Ellison's entire life seems designed to eliminate unpredictability wherever possible.
And yet technology itself is unpredictable.
True, which is why he wants to dominate it. If you can't tame uncertainty, you can at least own it.
Another imaginary scenario. If Ellison were forced into a role where he had no control, no authority, no leverage, just presence, how do you think he'd respond?
I think he'd experience that as existential threat, not boredom, not frustration, but danger. Control isn't a preference for him, it's a necessity.
That's chilling, but it aligns with everything we've discussed.
Yes. When control equals safety, surrender becomes impossible.
The book subtly asks whether such a life is admirable or tragic, but never answers. Where do you land?
I think it's both. Admirable in its coherence, tragic in its narrowness. A life lived with extraordinary intensity, but limited emotional range.
Intensity can crowd out softness.
And softness, for Ellison, feels like exposure.
There's also the question of impact. Oracle has shaped global infrastructure. Databases, governments, corporations. Ellison's decisions ripple outward enormously.
Yes, and that amplifies the ethical weight of his personality. When power scales, character matters more, not less.
Which makes the book feel almost like a case study in why psychological insight into leaders is essential.
Exactly. This isn't gossip. It's governance by personality.
If someone in power read this book, what lesson do you hope they'd take?
That self-awareness without self-limitation is dangerous. Knowing your drives doesn't absolve you of responsibility for their effects.
And if an aspiring entrepreneur read it,
I'd hope they'd see that success extracted through fear and domination comes with invisible costs. To others and to yourself,
costs that don't show up on balance sheets.
but show up in culture, trust, and psychological safety.
As we come to the end, I want to ask the question we avoided earlier. Is this a book you'd recommend?
Yes, but with a warning. Not as a guide, but as a lens. Read it to understand power, not to copy it.
I feel the same. It's not a how-to. It's a why. Is this like this?
Exactly. And that makes it valuable.
What stayed with you the most after closing the book?
The sense that brilliance and insecurity can coexist comfortably. That achievement doesn't necessarily heal wounds. It can simply build structures around them.
For me, it was the realization that dominance can be a form of self-soothing.
That's very well put.
So if we had to distill the core message, not as praise or condemnation, but as observation, what would it be?
That power magnifies personality. It doesn't correct it. And that systems built around a single psyche will inevitably reflect its fractures.
I'd add that success can be an incredibly efficient way to avoid asking certain questions.
And that avoidance, when scaled, shapes the world.
Chris, this has been one of the most rigorous conversations we've had on the show.
Because the subject demands it. This book doesn't allow surface-level engagement.
And neither does the world it describes.
Exactly.
Thank you for bringing such depth and clarity to this discussion.
Thank you, David. These conversations matter more than ever.
And to everyone listening, thanks for staying with us through the complexity. Until next time.